Welcome back. Coronavirus has infected over 792,000 people in South Africa and killed more than 21,600. Despite months of strict restrictions in movement, President Cyril Ramaphosa ruling out a second national hard lockdown for the time being. However, we will hear from him when he addresses the nation in less than 30 minutes from now. So, the first nationwide shutdown earlier this year severely battered Africa's most industrialized economy, throwing at least 2.2 million people out of work. What are we expecting from the president, and what will be the impact of this? To talk more about this, Ms. Lebohang Pheko, political economist and senior research fellow at the Trade Collective. A very good evening to you, and thank you so much for taking the time, Ms. Pheko. Naturally, pressure is on to rein in the new infections before the end of the year holidays. We know that people tend to use this period to crisscross the country to visit family and loved ones. Will he face a fallout from this? As in, should he shut that down, movement between the provinces, will that put him in a very bad light with South Africans?
It probably will. This is the time of year that most people traditionally either move across borders or within the country, provincial borders or even state borders. Countries like Lesotho, Swaziland, Botswana, Zimbabwe, Namibia, our immediate neighbors, and sometimes even beyond that, whether it's recreationally or to go home to see loved ones. And of course, within the country, we usually enjoy quite a vibrant tourism sector at this time of the year. I think that the president is between a rock and a hard place in this instance, because obviously the last thing we want is the mobility of the virus to continue to spread across the country. And of course, I mean, people are already talking about changing their plans, staying in land, staying in the city, staying in Johannesburg or within province to try to contain it. But there's not much that can be done. I don't think it can actually be helped. But I think that there's also a lot of responsibility that we can take as people, in terms of trying to keep ourselves safe, continue with the masks, but also to avoid unnecessary risk and avoid unnecessarily subjecting ourselves to risk. And if that means staying at home, it's as unpopular as it might be. That may have to be the way that the president deems it most appropriate to deal with it.
Perhaps it'll be helpful to put into context for people so that they understand what the territorial effects has been on national, subnational governments in management of the crisis of COVID-19.
Sorry, please repeat your question.
I was saying perhaps it would be helpful for us to break it down to the nation, the territorial effects of COVID-19 on national government and subnational governments, how it means that we'd have to look at it from that prism first before we start saying this would be the best way to handle it.
Well, I mean, it depends on, it comes down to the basic conundrum, which I think is the difference between having an ethical, compassionate view of how to deal with this crisis, how to deal with the pandemic, or whether it's a purely corporatist one. So there's been this ongoing dichotomy between whether we should save jobs and save the economy, or whether we should save lives. And unfortunately, I think that the balance has been quite tricky to meet, and certainly there's been an ethical dilemma in the ways in which the healthcare system, the education system has found itself completely wanting. Ongoing and inherent fragilities have been exposed during this time, as we know, the healthcare system and the education system, where high levels of comorbidity and cross-infection have taken place. But I think the other thing is that the economy has shrunk in South Africa by about 51% in the second quarter. And that's possibly one of the worst, some reports believe that this is possibly one of the worst declines in the last 100 years or so, and one of the worst contractions that's been recorded. And when we look at these sorts of figures, we also have to think around how in fact the social benefit system and the social benefit architecture needs to be reorientated away from one of what I call welfareist charity, and the notion that the government and the state is somehow doing people a favor by giving this sort of support. This is our tax money, by the way, so it's not really a favor. We are subsidizing this, and we should. And how then this should really act as a bridge towards a different kind of social system, a social contract contract between the state and its citizens, whether it's people who are temporarily unemployed, long-term unemployed, businesses which are flailing due to the coronavirus, and so on. So there's a need for the redistribution, quite a sharp redistribution of resources, and a sharp redistribution of skills and labor, and a sharp redistribution of income, cash injections into the high capital intensive and high labor retensive parts of the economy. So in terms of, when you say that, national versus provincial jurisdiction, there's a massive imbalance between the ways provinces have been able to manage this. One of the advantages that I think we have in this country, unlike, say, the US or different parts of, the global north, and for example, is that we're not a federated state. So what happens in Gauteng is going to happen in Mpumalanga, is going to happen in the Eastern Cape. So that kind of policy coherence at this time has been extremely useful.
And it would be interesting because, as you say, there have been a lot of difficult trade-offs that have had to be made in managing this crisis. And one of them has been the scale of lockdown collapse on GDP. Typically, major production firms, as you mentioned, at this time would be on a break, and the hospitality and retail industries will be banking on those sales that typically occur during this period. They're very reliant on so-called bums on seats or beds. So what kind of decisions then come into play? Because the truth of the matter is, if the Western Cape and the Eastern Cape, which are very popular holiday destinations, are besieged with this, then what would be the wise thing to do? Limiting travel between the two, or just separating them from, all other provinces in terms of travel?
It's very difficult. There've already been about over 1.4 or 1.5 million significant real job losses in South Africa this year. Certainly, I think that the coronavirus has probably cost the hospitality sector, estimates say, about 330,000 jobs. That's a huge chunk, over a quarter of a million. And that's one of our most vibrant sectors. Some people have described it as a tsunami. And there's some businesses which are gone and which are not going to be rehabilitated, which I think is extremely unfortunate, given that there has been this COVID funding, which has been very difficult for many businesses to access. So that's the one piece, is the accessibility of business relief funding for small businesses, small to medium businesses in particular. And I'm on record as saying many times that there's hardly anybody. I've spoken to about 12, 15 good friends or associates, and none of them who has tried to access the COVID funding has been able to do so. I think the architecture of disbursement to save, especially legacy businesses, old businesses which have been labor intensive for a really long time and which have been part of the social ecology in particular areas, need to be salvaged. But secondly, I think then the mobility between provinces is quite important, because or the lack thereof. And it goes back to your initial question of making very unpopular choices. If, however, the state is willing, out of this 500 billion that has been set aside, and remember that out of the initial relief, COVID relief fund, it was about 10%. That accounts for 10% of GDP of this country. It's actually one of the most generous per capita COVID relief funds in the world, and for a country of our size in terms of our economy, it's really quite incredible. Pity, of course, that some of the allocation has been extremely unfortunate, but there is within that scope to ensure that particular key sectors within and between provinces are protected, so that the mobility can be minimized. So people are bound to move, truckers, production. So a lot of production, delivery, manufacturing, of course, takes place within and between provinces, across provinces. There has to be a way to improve the social and the delivery infrastructure that then minimizes risk. And this can be done, I think, if the state is much more willing to be dynamic and to be nimble in the ways in which, and much more swift in the ways in which businesses are given relief funds, so that we don't have to have these, I think, crazy choices between saving the economy as if the economy is a human being and saving human lives, which is quite essential at this time.
And it's interesting that you raise that. I mean, you also did point out the management at regional or municipal level. When we look at the Resurgence. The Western Cape was obviously initially worst affected. It was said its management thereof was very much to be lauded, but it finds itself in the same place. And there are people who have said the thing about COVID-19 is that it has reinforced some of the trends, pre-existing trends, like social divisions. So how does it then learn from what it's done previously? Because it goes deeper than the health problem, as you say.
So that's a really interesting question, because as you rightly say, this is not, and South Africa is not unique in this. This has absolutely buttressed and reinforced existing social, racial, gendered inequalities, where there has been racism, where there has been patriarchy, where there has been sexism, where there have been shocking labor conditions and so on. What this has done is only to reinforce these sort of fragilities and these sort of structural fissures that already exist in our social economic landscape. And what this actually means is that even though that the state has been talking about structural reform, which I think should be treated with caution. Structural reform should really not be about doing more of the same, because typically when the state talks about structural reform, regrettably, it has tended to mean a polite form of structural adjustment, a polite way of saying that we're going to open up businesses, open up the economy even more to foreign direct investment. We're going to deregulate even further, and so forth. It also means that the currency controls are slightly less rigorous. It also means that typically as well that when we think about inclusive growth and competitiveness, we are not thinking about a growth that is inclusive of social dignity, of environmental considerations, of positive healthcare, of free education that's qualitative, of good roads. It's very corporatist and it's very outward looking. It's very much looking at the ways in which other countries, and not even African countries, but the global north, Europe, US, how easy, the ease of doing business and so forth. And yet what we really need to think about is what this means. In terms of our telecommunications, what this actually means for ourselves, first of all, given that a lot of us are now spending exponentially more time and exponentially more bandwidth and screen time. What it also means in terms of harnessing, transport and construction opportunities, the construction of good houses, of quality houses, but also the construction of qualitative healthcare and qualitative schooling. What does it also mean in terms of a much more flexible trade and industry policy, which is what the original, structural reform calls for. But when we talk about flexibility, again, I get very nervous because it suggests that it is this two tiers: the one which is deregulated and subject to labor abuses, no protection, and so forth. Flexible is really a way of, I think, rescinding on very basic labor relations. So it's a whole menu of a new social orientation and a complete pivot away from the corporatist trickle-down market orthodoxy, which over the last 26 years, since 1994, has failed quite abysmally, and COVID and Corona have only exacerbated how glaringly these approaches have failed over the last while.
And just to again refocus and emphasize what we're talking about here, the decisions that President Cyril Ramaphosa has to make and what he'll announce. We are speaking about the differentiated regional impact. So he's facing increased pressure to accelerate reforms of power and the telecom sectors, as you just mentioned, especially because the pandemic has erased more than a decade of fragile growth. So how does he approach this? In the sense that this is pretty much downtime, people are looking for that, but it's also been a difficult period. People will be looking for work, so we need some sort of activity in the economy. But we also have to make sure that people are policed. People are not adhering to the public safety measures. Do we need greater intervention from law enforcement? Do we give greater autonomy to the provinces on how to handle this period?
That's an interesting question as well, because And I do think that the national policy coherence is a better approach, only because I think we have not been very good at managing a lot of the finer details, which are the big details. For example, the disbursement of PPEs, the disbursement of the opportunities to distribute those PPEs, the tenders, and the things that have gone very wrong, the quite disgraceful excesses and corruption that has taken place as a result, I think would be even more difficult to manage if we then multiply that by 9 other provinces rather than as a coherent national platform of action. But bear in mind that law enforcement has been extremely difficult during this time, and again, that goes back to our ongoing very fractious social relations. So we already had the Marikana massacre. We've already had different excesses where it's clear. It seems that public order policing in this country is very combative, and even the language of community policing is one that we don't use anymore. We only see police as people who are enforcers, and sometimes people who are aggressors, sometimes people who are to be feared rather than to be people who we think of as being part of our community in a way that's safe and in a way that's enabling, and people who make us feel as though they are enabling us to do what needs to be done, move around safely, and so on and so forth. And I mean, many people, the research has shown that across provinces, there are different experiences even of community policing, as you say. So, for example, the Western Cape, many respondents there have said that this level of proximity of policing is really not unusual to them. 50% of people there in some communities have said that they see police officers or are harassed by police officers a couple of times a week. So I think for many people, there's a clear class and race demarcation in policing in this country, which again is something that didn't arrive with Corona, but certainly is something that cannot continue to be framed in this way. And I think that some of the excesses we've already seen, where people have been killed in this country. We talk about George Floyd, but we have had many George Floyds in this country. I want to remember the gentleman's name. I think it was Collins Chauke, who was killed at exactly the same time, the same date as George Floyd. We hardly talk about this, and I think that again, you're quite right. And there could be some merit in a differentiated approach, but I'm wary of it because even at national coherent level, national level, where this is a top-down, top-tier pyramid approach, there are real dilemmas and real issues with compliance.
Which also raises a very interesting point. There's been a lot of talk about leadership at this point, but I'm often puzzled as to what we're really looking for here. On the one level, we want to judge the president's leadership, but at the same time, we're calling for greater citizen participation. Is it possible within both? There are these national disaster regulations under which we must operate, and yet as individuals, we're saying you've got to do your part. So how are we devolving that responsibility in terms of multi-level coordination bodies, for instance? Is there equal space for those to exist?
Yes, and what do we mean by leadership? I think we often, use these terms at times like this in ways that are quite generic. The president must lead, and then there's a vote of no confidence, and so forth. This is really part of, I think, an ongoing dilemma around what it means to be a leader in this country. We've been talking about the lack of diverse leadership, the lack of multi-sectoral, lack of multi-generational leadership. Where, for example, at the Tripartite Alliance, for example, what has become of that, and where is the pushback in that regard? Where is, in fact, even the opportunities that there used to be, for us, such as NEDLAC, which is supposed to bring, business, labor, to a very tiny extent, the community sector. Community is a big animal, yeah, and government together. And I'm aware that they had or are having some sort of an endeavor, right now. In fact, I think it was just a couple of days ago. But how then does this trickle down to? I don't know if trickle down is where's the participation? Who is vested in this form of leadership? I think the other thing is that there's just a lack of consequence management. Often, even where leadership has been so compromised. Oftentimes, where we see that there's been allegations that are quite atrocious and quite unacceptable. Rather than stepping back, there is a culture, it seems, in the public sector of either protecting, closing rank around the officials involved, or even the ministers involved, or just disappearing them to be deployed at another level. And that sends a message that if it's okay for them, it's okay for everybody else. So let alone by the time you get to, hospital leadership, leadership in the education sector, principals, teachers, faith-based organization, and so forth. But I also think that we have got too much of a top-down approach to what leadership actually is. I don't think we're always getting very good examples from the higher ups in official office. But I also do think that there is the opportunity to build lateral leadership and to look beyond elected officials for solutions and I think for inspiration.
We've got less than 2 minutes. If the president is listening to any of this, I think a lot of that probably drilling down to disjointed responses, but also competition for resources. You've also mentioned that the plans that government has put in place has not really trickled down to the people in need. So if people are saying now is the time to act quickly and boldly to place South Africa on a rapid growth trajectory while also keeping people safe, what would you say is urgently needed?
Where do we begin? I think that we certainly need some sort of an economic injection, a plan that can rehabilitate both the economy and the social contract. And one is not bigger than the other, because without people, without a social contract that's viable, without workers that are healthy, there is no economy really. And I have heard some morbid approaches to say that in history, there's always been a season of culling, and I think that that's quite callous, and I think that it's entirely inappropriate. Remember that at this time, we are at a time where, as I said, that our GDP our growth has contracted by about 51%. That's one of the biggest growth contractions in the second quarter. We're also at a time where about 4.2 million rands had, two people were previously unreached by this social contract. I think that's a good thing. I think that it shows that the net has been expanded. So I think that we need to look at expanding that. We should look at much better data and telecoms management and communication to ensure greater coverage and greater accessibility, especially for communities that have never been part of the digital divide. We've been hearing about crossing the digital divide for 20 or 25 years. This is as good a time as any to cross that Rubicon. I also think that it's an important time for us to rethink what work actually is. So rethinking the care economy at a time when many people, particularly women, particularly Black women, have had to expand that role far more because of our socioeconomic circumstances, where we cannot outsource to the same extent as other race groups because of the the lineage of our wealth of our wealth inheritance, which is much smaller than other racial groups. And lastly, I think that the Reserve Bank, one more time, has to rethink its mandate and think about ways in which they could potentially lend the state money into the key sectors which are high labor intensive, which employ greater, more people, which employ more women, more Black women in particular. Think about how to rescue or how to subsidize those for a period of time. I'm also not a fan of printing money, but I do think that it is important to put some money for a limited time, which can be lent back to the Reserve, on loan, which should be brought back.
All right, thank you very much, Ms. Lebohang Pheko, political economist and senior research fellow at Trade Collective. President Cyril